Welcome to Dementia Forum X YouTube channel. Today we're talking to Irene Meier, a neuroscientist focusing on Alzheimer's. Hi, Irene.
Hi, Tobias.
So, could you talk a little bit about yourself and what you're doing?
Sure. So I'm a clinical neuropsychologist and neuroscientist, and I've worked with Alzheimer's disease for over 10 years at this point. I started with the focus on vascular risk factors for Alzheimer's disease, a little bit of neuroimaging, and then transitioned more into more innovative ways of diagnosing neurodegenerative diseases such as digital biomarkers as well.
That sounds very interesting, and I'm very interesting to hear what you have to say about these things. But you're also a member of an organization called BrainFit4Life. Could you talk a little bit about that organization and what you wish to accomplish there?
Absolutely. Yeah, so we're BrainFit4Life. It's a task force, dementia-focused task force in Switzerland. And we have multiple members across the country, but also ambassadors beyond the borders of Switzerland. And we're three main members in the organizing committee. So Dr. Lavinia Albury and Dr. Bogdan Dragansky, which are also talking to you, I think. We started this together in 2019, around September, and really have gotten quite a large number of people together across Switzerland, which includes clinicians, pharma company representatives, insurance company representatives, startups as well. And they established multiple goals. So we do have several events a year where people come together to discuss urgent topics. And then we have 4 goals. The first one being brain health registry, so really synchronizing data across the country, across disciplines. It's a small country. We do speak 4 languages, but everybody's relatively fluent in English as well, so communication shouldn't be an issue. Then we want to, we want to make sure that we provide for better data to diagnose people better and earlier and more reliably. And data is the key to that. So that's one of our first goals. We do want to also increase awareness, so dementia is less stigmatized, but also improve this translation from research into the clinician's office, and then really share that information with the patient. Another goal would be early diagnosis. There are currently new tools in the development as well, and we believe that something like a yearly dementia test when you do your annual checkup at the doctor, that would be the ideal to get to, because it's important to have historic data of a particular patient. And if you follow the patient over time, it will be easier to notice changes that happen over time. And I think, especially when we talk about diseases, we need to understand what healthy aging or what normal means, the normal state means. And it's incredibly hard, especially in Alzheimer's disease, to define that. Like in the case of Alzheimer's disease, you can have a pathology, but you might not show any cognitive symptoms. So are you diseased or not? Are you, is it something you should tell the patient or not? It might never affect them. But technically, they have the pathology. So I think these stages, especially before we see cognitive and behavioral changes, are important because the pathology is already there. And with this natural history of the disease, trying to understand that, we'll get more insight every time. So it will be ideal, yes, for more people to really have, a healthy, their healthy baseline.
Okay, and so you're talking about a yearly annual kind of test. Now, at which age do you think it's most appropriate to start doing those annually?
That's a difficult question. The sooner the better to really get a robust baseline. For now, we suggest age 60 because, of course, it's not cheap either. I think it would really require everyone to pull on the same strings as well to make sure, like, insurance reimburses, for example, for that. But when you notice this early changes, there's still a way to intervene. There are, and that's another part of BrainFit4Life, of what we want to achieve, as well as this brain health program. So that we know there are things that we can do, lifestyle changes that can be maybe not entirely preventive, but slow down the course of the disease. The WHO picked up on that. This is coming out of the Finger study from Finland. And it really shows like exercise, healthy diet. So these are things that we've seen and being observed over the years as well. But really now this was an incredible study that, should serve as a basis for us to really bring that out to the patient.
Okay, yeah, thank you for those answers. What are the major hurdles when it comes to diagnosing dementia today?
I think one of the big issues is really the heterogeneity of the disease. We're starting to understand, we call something Alzheimer's disease, but we're starting to realize there are so many different phenotypes, and it's so hard to capture it early. And then a lot of the stigma is another problem. A lot of people, they might not want to know, or they might not want to go to the doctor and find out, or they might just think it's normal. A lot of times when you talk to someone and you tell them, you have like cognitive decline, their first response will be, well, but it's normal, I'm older. But there is a cutoff, right, between like what is normal and what is not normal. And so I think these multiple phenotypes, like perhaps we're looking at different diseases, multiple different diseases, and that's not a very popular opinion just yet, but it's a valid hypothesis, and I think something that we should take into consideration. And then there are a few other, if you look at it worldwide, there are a few other issues when it comes to diagnosing, which is a lot of cultural differences. We have that as well, like in the neuropsychology space, for example, like language aspects, educational aspects, translating a test into a different language and validating it there. One typical one being, producing as many words with a specific letter. And I mean, the letters are adapted to a certain amount of how often this words appear in this language that start with a certain letter, but you can't compare it really. Then there's a lot of socioeducational differences as well. It's incredibly hard to measure cognitive decline in people who might have only 2, 3, 4 years of education. There's a lot of paper pencil-based tests that require writing, when some people, they might not be able to write, they don't know how to write, they never learned it. So these are some of the main challenges, at least from like a neuropsychological perspective. But then there's also different approaches in different countries. So in the US, for example, PET scans are quite widespread. In Europe, people do more lumbar puncture to measure aberrant proteins like amyloid and tau. And it's really hard, that makes it really hard to compare these data also across different cohorts. So in Latin America, there's no such testing at all. You do an MRI. The MRI might not be the most sensitive tool, especially early on, because this shows neurodegeneration, which is usually already in like more advanced stage of the disease. So it's very, very different, and I think that makes it incredibly hard.
All right, so you talked a little bit about what problems we see today with diagnosis. Could you talk a little bit about what are the best tools available for us today when it comes to diagnosing dementia?
So I'm not a doctor. I'll leave that up to Bogdan to really talk about that in more detail, but I can speak a little bit to the neuropsychological aspects of it. I think in general, there's no one tool for that. I think it will have to be a combination of multiple things, and that's how it's been working in the past. I think neuropsychology is one big aspect of that as well. And the tools are also getting better. So we do have markers. I mean, this is something that is relatively new as well. These digital biomarkers, for example, this is something that has been incredibly surprising to me, what we're able to measure with just a smartphone, for example. And that gives us new insight. Not only is it more real world data, having a patient really use such a tool in their home environment, or have it like passively measuring parameters as the patient goes about their days, but also gives us insight into things that we perhaps didn't think of, or we didn't have a good way of characterizing or objectively measuring before. Things like motor aspects in Alzheimer's disease. We typically think if there's motor aspects, we think of Parkinson's disease or Huntington's disease. There have been studies in the 2010, around that, that show that certain neurologists, they have observed, for example, a tremor. But of course, it's incredibly hard to, it might be, let's say if you quantified it on a scale from 1 to 3, it might be a 2 for someone and a 3 for another clinician. And it's not very objectively measured. A lot of times they also go kind of unnoticed. They go as like observations into the clinical report, but it was almost impossible to measure it really objectively until more recently, when people started figuring out you can actually measure that with the smartphone, with just the gyroscope, with the accelerometer of the smartphone. You can measure gait, you can measure tremor, you can measure unnatural movements that maybe changed within the patient. And we didn't typically think of Alzheimer's disease to have motor aspects, but now this just opens a whole new array of knowledge that we acquire about this disease.
Are there any emerging technologies on the horizon that might become a game changer in regards to diagnosing dementia?
That's an excellent question. I think, as I mentioned before, there might not be just one answer to all of it. I don't think one tool can do it all. Ideally, that would be the case, but there's a lot happening right now in the Alzheimer's disease and technology space. There are new blood-based biomarkers that are currently investigated. We have the digital biomarkers. There are things like portable MRIs or almost portable or PET scans that can, just be moved from one place to another, become much more available, much cheaper, like maybe 1/10 of the price. We have artificial intelligence to try to understand patterns, to try to read MRI scans, not just like a clinical read, but really measuring and detecting early changes. So we're starting to see a lot more. There's something called digital twins, like virtual clinical trials, which is also something incredibly promising. I think you reduce the patient burden, you reduce the amount of patients that you need for a clinical trial, you accelerate the process by far, and that's really a step towards precision medicine, and I think that's what we're supposed to go, and I think that requires much more than just one specific tool.
Okay, thank you for your answers to these questions. Everything you said is totally fascinating. And if I understand you correctly, we have a lot of interesting things to look forward to in the future in regards to diagnostic tools, and also in regards to making it more available for people where it is not available right now. And that your organization is speeding up that change that needs to happen.
We hope so. I mean, there's change that is happening across the world, and in a good way. And I think with this pandemic, we also we were forced to accelerate the ways we have to, and also really protect our patients better, not to expose them, not to have them necessarily go to the hospital. And that's, I think, where these digital efforts come in, right? Where and there's so many technology, the big tech companies that are also kind of moving towards the healthcare sector. And like with an Apple Watch, that would be an example of a passive digital biomarker. The patient doesn't have to, give it extra attention. It measures so many health parameters. It measures gait, it measures activity, it measures what time you get up in the morning. It measures your circadian rhythm, for example. And then there's people, inventing things on top of that, or maybe using like geolocation, or how much people socialize, which has also had a big impact during this pandemic, like not being able to meet people, being isolated at home, accelerating, cognitive decline, not just through the virus, but also being locked in at home, being alone, loneliness, like increasing depression as well, and not being physically active. Things that became possible at the same time, patients weren't able to go see their doctors. Patients from clinical trials, they weren't able to follow, their schedule. And so that has been very disruptive on the one hand, but also I think it has accelerated innovations, especially in this digital space, by a lot. And so I mentioned the Apple Watch. That's just one marker. You can just use your smartphone. And most people at this point, even elderly, they use smartphones nowadays, or they have smartphones nowadays. And it measures your activity levels just as much if you bring it along on your walk, if you carry it around during the day. You can measure how often people interact with social media, for example, if they do. Perhaps you don't get the exact picture because maybe they'll use it part-time on the phone, part-time on a computer, and you won't get the other side. So you really also always want to have a context when you look at these passive markers to understand behavior and behavioral change. And then there are a few, or I guess a lot of efforts also in the active digital biomarker space. So active being an app, a game, for example, where the patient really has to pay attention to a certain game or to a certain task, resolve the task as well. Ideally, the tasks will adapt to the patient and the patient level. As they're getting better, they might get more difficult, or there are apps that help diagnose patients earlier using AI, for example. There are apps that are being created that are used as digital interventions. So based on the patient's performance, they adapt like a video game. When you get to the next level, they adapt to the patient's strengths and weaknesses, and really train specific aspects of where the patient has deficits or weakness, and where they could actually profit from a very targeted, specialized intervention. So I think there's a lot of promising efforts right now. The FDA actually created a Center of Excellence. This is how much is really going on right now. They accelerated a few processes in terms of approval for digital tools, digital biomarkers, but also with the Center of Excellence, it really shows that collectively we're moving, the entire field is moving towards digitalization of the healthcare system. And it's actually incredibly exciting, because I mentioned this example with movement aspects before in Alzheimer's disease. I mean, this is just one. A lot of these things are not validated yet because they're relatively new efforts that will take a few years and multiple studies to show and really establish these relationships and also what they mean. But we're able to measure so much more at this point already, which is really encouraging. And so I'm hoping that we will accelerate our abilities to diagnose Alzheimer's disease. There is a drug that might come to the market in 2021. So that's also encouraging news. So there's a lot happening in the Alzheimer's space right now, and exciting times to participate.
So how does this connect to dementia care?
So I think I'm more in the diagnostic side of things. I wish with early diagnostics, of course, we can delay the disease and de-accelerate the process. But of course, there's also the side of the caregivers and dementia care in general. I'm aware that there are a few apps as well being developed for dementia caregivers. I'm familiar with a few also focus groups or support groups, patient support groups as well, for people to show that they're not alone, maybe exchange experiences that they've had. And really try to give each other support. And on the care side, I mean, there again, speaking of innovation, there are so many things that we're learning these days. There are, there are other, digital innovations or interventions that are, for example, sensors in a shoe, for example, that measure your gait, cameras that you can install in the house and prevent falls or detect someone and increase risk for falls. There are smart homes, especially in Sweden. With IKEA, I'm aware that there are a few smart homes also in the making for elderly people to really reduce the risk of patients falling, of needing surgery, which adds an additional burden. surgery in an elderly patient comes with multiple risks and with anesthesia. So if you can prevent that from happening, that's another great innovation to really look forward to.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. And thank you for answering my questions today and for participating in this brand new YouTube channel. We are going to talk to 2 more people from your organization, BrainFit4Life, which is going to be equally interesting. And yeah, so thank you very much, and have a nice evening.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you so much.
Thank you.